Wouldn't it be nice to have several thought leaders in your industry know and love your brand? Start a podcast. Invite your industry's thought leaders to be guests on your show, and start reaping the benefits of having a network full of industry influencers. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Hello, and welcome to the B2B Growth Show Monthly Book Talk. I'm Douglas Burdett, host of the Marketing Book Podcast, where each week I publish an interview with the author of a new marketing or sales book to help my listeners succeed in the quickly changing world of marketing and sales. And joining me is my friend James Muir, author of The Perfect Close, The Secret to Closing Sales, the Best-Selling Practices and Techniques for Closing the Deal. I read every book featured on the Marketing Book Podcast, but James reads even more books than I do, and he listens to every episode of the Marketing Book Podcast. So I'm delighted that he can join me. And in this monthly episode of the B2B Growth Show, we briefly recap some of the key ideas from the marketing and sales books that were recently featured on the Marketing Book Podcast. James, welcome to the B2B Growth Show Book Talk.
Thank you, Douglas. It's great to be back. In this episode, we're going to talk about 4 of the recent books featured on the Marketing Book Podcast, which are, first, Loserthink, How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America by Scott Adams. Second, we have The SelfReliance Entrepreneur, 366 Daily Meditations to Feed Your Soul and Grow Your Business by John Jantsch. Third, we have Beyond Product by Jill Soley and Todd Wilms. And finally, The 10 Stories That Great Leaders Tell by Paul Smith. So, on to the books. First up, we've got Loserthink, How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America by Dilbert cartoonist Scott Adams. And this is an interesting book on critical thinking with some poignant and often hilarious examples in it. So tell us a little bit about Scott Adams' Loserthink.
Well, as you may have heard, Scott Adams has gone from cartoonist, and he's had other businesses as well, but he's become a little bit controversial because he's become much more of a political pundit.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't read it, but there was another book he wrote a year or two ago called Win Bigly, I think it was. It was on the persuasive techniques that Donald Trump uses. And this one, he talks about political things, but I didn't get the sense that he was taking any sides, but he would talk about political issues as it relates to a point he was making. So this book is about all the different ways that people think. In other words, the different mental models, and like how an engineer is trained to think, how a lawyer is trained to think, how a historian is trained to think, on and on and on. And he explains that a lot of people are in what he calls mental prisons, meaning they're being sort of trapped and they don't realize that they're trapped in this mode of thinking. And it was maybe a little bit of a departure for a lot of the marketing and sales books that are on the show, but really interesting. And it's got what I'm calling it's got a very long aftertaste, and a good aftertaste. I keep thinking about it almost every day. And so he explains, like I said, why people think the way they do. And I guess after reading that book, I am perhaps a little more empathetic for why people think the way they do and less judgmental. In other words, the late father-in-law I had, who was really keen on communism, it got a little tiresome at Thanksgiving dinner. And now I kind of understood why he thought the way he did. And in fact, in the interview with Scott Adams, I even said, this is a great book to get just before Thanksgiving, here in the U.S. when a lot of families come together, because it helps you better understand why people think the way they do. And then he even includes, ways to help them break out of their mental prisons.
Right.
But I don't want to get into arguing with people. But it was very interesting. And I'll tell you something else from that book. I don't like television news. And now I really don't like television news. In fact, interesting, very trivial story. When I go to my gym, there's a bank of televisions. There's not always a lot of people there. So people can go up and change the channel. I mean, you ask other people if it's okay. And I will go up and change the channel on the televisions that are near where I am. And I don't really care what channels it is, as long as it's not these people on news channels, like, whatever it is, right wing, left wing, middle of the road. I'll put on like the weather channel or the home and garden channel, or maybe even the sports channels, just because he explains in his book, or reminds a lot of us, that news has gone from information to brain manipulation, he says. And what he means by that is that in the past, there were fewer news outlets and they were basically providing information. Whereas now, their business model works much better for them if they can get people outraged and get them angry and keep them watching through the TV commercials. And I think it's a similar brain chemical as when you're at a casino and you just can't stop gambling. And that's why the casinos don't have any windows or clocks on the wall, because they don't want you to sense that it's passing. And he says, you can't blame the news media, because that really works well for them because it keeps people engaged. And you may have heard of people who will watch these news channels for hours and hours.
He called it political warming, right? He said now that the world society can keep track of, we know that this headline leads better than this headline, or we know that this gets more clicks than that. They're doing all the things that they know to manipulate our behaviors to get people, like you said, outraged, because that's what sells advertising.
Yeah, it keeps people watching, and it works for them. So I'm just, I guess it was even more because there was another book on the show a while back, The Invisible Brand, which we talked about in an earlier episode, where he talked about how machine learning and AI is making us all fall into more and more bubbles.
Echo chambers.
Yeah, echo chambers, because it's all that they're trying to please you. They want you to get what they think you want. And so, we all have a different feed on our social media based on what it thinks we want. So anyway, that was it was very interesting, and I think my cynical or suspicious marketing mind was sharpened up even more. But so it wasn't so much about marketing and sales, but I tell you what, it was helpful for when you're talking about ideas, or you're helping clients or colleagues work through certain kinds of problems. Every example he gave in the book, I was able to see why people behave the way they do based on how they think.
And not just that, he's giving you the right way to do it as well in each of these chapters. So I really, honestly, I can't think of a person that wouldn't benefit from this book, just because it's really about critical thinking. And so whenever you hear anything, whether it's a marketing idea or something you're seeing on TV, you can see, they're comparing it to nothing, right? There's, how is so-and-so doing? And they're compared to what, right?
Yeah.
And so you start to understand what is a good argument of that type, and when someone's intentionally using it for another purpose, you can see that it just sort of lifts up the veil, and you can see what's actually going on.
Yeah.
I think in terms of that one, just to remind there's a lot to dissect here, actually. So I thought it was a wonderful book. His takeaway was, take that peaking concept of taking the smallest step possible. That was the main thing he hoped that users or that readers would get from the book, is the concept of microsteps.
Yes, that was very helpful. And I've been thinking about that lately when I have to get up. He talks about how in one of the chapters, he was talking about how when you want to accomplish something, the problem that most people have is that they think about everything that has to be done. And he said that instead, you should think about just moving your pinky first, or whatever the smallest step is to get you started. And he talked about how years ago, when he decided he wanted to become a cartoonist, instead of thinking about all that was involved in producing all the content and getting it into the newspapers and all that, all he did was go to the store and buy his artist materials. And then a couple days later, he took them out of the bag. So he was just slowly getting started on that. Yeah, that was a great concept. And of course, he explains why that works. There's a fair amount of explanation of how the brain works in his book.
Agreed. So this book is from a cartoonist, but it is surprisingly practical, often humorous treatise on critical thinking. I really liked it. Did you have a favorite part of this book out of all the little mind traps that he talks about?
Like I said, I think it's that I was I'm able to observe why people are saying the things they do and think the way they do and not get as irritated.
Agreed. Paradigm shifting, that part.
Imagine it, a spreadsheet filled with rows and rows of your sales enablement assets. You've devoted 2 years to organizing this masterpiece, only for it to stop making sense. This was Chad Trabucco's reality. As the head of sales enablement at Glint, a LinkedIn company, he's responsible for instilling confidence in his sales reps and arming them with the information they need to do their jobs. However, when his glorious spreadsheet became too complex, he realized he needed a new system. That's when Chad turned to Guru. With Guru, the knowledge you need to do your job finds you. Between Guru's web interface, Slack integration, mobile app, and browser extension, teams can easily search for verified knowledge without leaving their workflow. No more siloed or staled information. Guru acts as your single source of truth. For Chad, this meant Glint sales reps were left feeling more confident doing their jobs. See why leading companies like Glint, Shopify, Spotify, Slack, and more are using Guru for their knowledge management needs. Visit b2bgrowth.getguru.com to start your 30-day free trial and discover how knowledge management can empower your revenue teams.
All right. Well, so next up, we've got the Self-Reliant Entrepreneur 366 Daily Meditations to Feed Your Soul and Grow Your Business by John Jantsch. This book is replacing my Great American Bathroom book because it's just got this wonderfully concise nature. And John's been on the show many times now. So tell us about the Self-Reliant Entrepreneur.
That's right. He is now a member of the Marketing Book Podcast 4-Timers Club, which, as the listeners will know, that gets him coupons at any Kansas City Taco Bell location. Oh yeah, it's very exclusive. These authors are writing more and more books just so they can, get higher on the tote board. Yes, that's right. I've unleashed a monster.
It's highly competitive.
So actually, I saw him at Content Marketing World a couple years ago, and I said, as I say to any author that I run into, I say, "Hey, any more books in the running in the works?" And he said, "Yeah, but it's kind of different." And basically, this is a book that draws on the transcendentalism literature movement of the 19th century, like Henry David Thoreau and Melville and Emily Dickinson and all of those folks. And a lot of what they wrote about were being self-reliant and taking charge of yourself and thinking independently. And I just thought it was brilliant that he liked them, he studied them a lot, and realized it was so such a neat overlay with the entrepreneurial world. And so what he did is, and I can only imagine this book must have taken him forever to research, because
no kidding,
every day there is an excerpt from one of those many authors. There's probably 20 different authors. And then he also writes what that means to an entrepreneur. And there's a different one for every day of the year. And he explains in the beginning about all of this sort of thing. And when I first heard about it, I told him it reminded me of the book that Ryan Holiday did called The Daily Stoic, which I have. And you open it up to a particular day, and it's something about how to think about Stoicism, and which I find very interesting. And both of them have it broken down into different parts of the year where they kind of group some of the different thoughts. Well, it turns out that they both have the same publicist. And so there was a little bit of cross-fertilization and very different topics. But the publicist, who actually I think was the co-author of Ryan Holiday's book, he kind of cut that idea in John's head. And this is a very, very thoughtful book. And now there are two books for when I wake up in the morning, Daily Stoic and the Self-Reliant Entrepreneur. So some of the transcendentalists they're a little slightly less accessible for some folks, but his synopsis or his summary of each day is really very thoughtful, and he really poured his heart and soul into this because there is a certain vulnerability with being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, you could tell. You could tell that when you're reading the material in each day. And it's a pretty broad range of subjects, mostly central to becoming a better person. I really like the theme. And in fact, I think it complements the Daily Stoic pretty good, actually. I think because of its nature, it probably will never get old. right? You could go back to June 11th and a year from now and get a totally different experience and perspective from reading that same thing. So I think that makes it probably a timeless book.
It also is such a great book to give to somebody that's starting their own business, or
totally
to give to someone who is already running their own business, has started their own business. It's a terrific gift. I'm going to be giving it a lot.
Agreed. And one of the things that you guys mentioned on the podcast interview was that question: what do you appreciate most about your entrepreneurial journey? And I thought that is a great question. It's just loaded with value if you just sort of contemplate that one question.
That's right. He's got a question for every day. And then the thing is, it's like, I want to say, I'm on to you, Jance. He asks this question and you think about it all day. Mm-hmm. It's really got me doing the one thing that I hate to do, which is think.
Well, his takeaway was that he hopes readers are going to just become more mindful by reading it. I don't know how you could not do that by. And so I have a lot of other John Jantsch books on my shelf, all marked up and dog-eared. But this book's never going to make it to my shelf because I've incorporated it, like you said, into your morning routine.
Yes, so. And he also mentioned in the interview, I don't know if you heard this, but it's got a ribbon in it. I don't know if you bought the hard copy, but there's a ribbon in it like you'd see in a Bible or a hymnal or something.
Sure.
So you can keep track of which day. And he just joked. He said, I always wanted to write a book that had a ribbon.
Now he's there. Well, think about it. He's distilled centuries of wisdom into these short, bite-sized chunks, to immediately gain access to this deeper level of leadership. So, yeah, I don't know. There are some people arguing that this is his best book. It's definitely different than the other marketing books, but I liked it a lot.
I think this book could be around long after John Jantsch is around. In other words, I think this book will outlive all of his other fantastic books. And by the way, his first really big book, probably the most famous one, is Duct Tape Marketing. In 2020, he's completely revising that and coming out with a new edition.
Oh, exciting. Well,
so stay tuned.
We will get early access, hopefully. Yeah. All right. Well, next up, we've got Beyond Product by Jill Soley and Todd Williams, that is. And I really enjoy concisely written books. If you can,
they're harder to write.
They are way harder to write, right? It's Mark Twain. Sorry, I wrote you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one, right?
Yeah.
So I would say it's this tightly wound ball of practical marketing insight. So tell us a little bit about your interview with Jill Soley.
The book is by two longtime Silicon Valley marketing pros. And so they're very in tune with the startup culture and so forth. And the funny story is that I was talking to a company one day some months ago, and they manufactured these products, and was talking to the CEO and founder, and he was just really frustrated. So, was talking to me sort of like, what's the answer? What's the silver bullet? And I said, well, yeah, I wish there were one, but there's certain things you need to do. And we weren't going to be able to help him, but I was able to recommend a couple of books, as I'm happy to do for any listener that contacts me, depending upon what their situation is. And I just thought, he thinks he's got the greatest product in the world. He has absolutely no sense of what he's trying to accomplish here. The very next day, her book showed up, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is a book that is different from the others, and this is what I wanted to be able to recommend to that particular fellow I was talking about. So this, she explained, and I should also say, James, that in reading this book as a marketing guy, I was reading it thinking, no, I can't believe you're having to explain that. And then even in the interview, we were laughing about, she goes, there are some really very smart, extraordinarily well-funded people in Silicon Valley, for instance, or the tech world, and she's actually having to explain to them some of the most basic marketing things. So I think that this book was short. I think shorter books are harder to write. They're always good. And this was very concise. And it was almost like you could use this to explain it to somebody who just got off a spaceship, what marketing is and what kind of marketing person you need at different stages of your growth. And one of the most important concepts in the book was product market fit. And the problem there is one of, as it always is in marketing and sales, is empathy. They don't understand that what they're selling is not necessarily what their customers are buying. And there's all kinds of things they need to do to figure out if there is in fact really a demand for this. And sometimes they actually overthink it. They overcook it. So what were your thoughts?
No, I thought it was fantastic there. In that area you're talking about, don't focus on too large a market was a common pitfall that she sees. And I think I see when I go visit clients, and where does the product fit into their lives? And even if you're something new and you think you have no competitors, there's always alternatives to what you're doing. There's always an alternative to what you're doing. And so you don't want to, startups tend to think they don't have a competitor out there because they're doing something brand new, but that's not, whatever the status quo is there. So I enjoyed that. Not only that, she's broken it down into these five components of marketing: corporate marketing, demand generation, marketing operations, product marketing. And I would think that my favorites would be the field marketing, which is sort of that importance of the marketing and sales alignment between those two. And so, but like you say, this is like a little field guide to how do you take someone from really small to really big. And they've done it masterfully in a very small format. So I enjoyed the whole thing. Other chapters include things like prove the product, prove the business, exiting the business, hiring, outcomes-based marketing, about measuring what you're doing.
My favorite chapter, though, was one that I've never seen a chapter title in any of the hundreds of books that have been on the show. It's chapter 2, which is titled, "What is Marketing?"
That's getting at the ground level, folks.
And for me, it's so interesting. I learn things in this book, as I do from all of them. But what's also interesting to me is how an author explains a concept that I'm already familiar with. Because I just really admire how a lot of these authors are able to explain something in a new or different way that might be clearer to people that are not familiar with our world.
Agreed. Actually, the thing I really like the best about this book, and is a theme that keeps coming up on excellent books on your show, is it is just stunning how many organizations don't spend any time with their clients. And you just cannot be successful in any way if you don't understand who your customer is, and if you're trying to and addressing the problems that they have. And yet, nobody is doing this. Nobody is doing this. We're supposed to focus on solving their problems, not on selling your product. That's a line I highlighted in the book as soon as I saw that, because that is such a common thing, is that we think about our products rather than thinking about the problems that we're solving for customers.
Yes, and there was another quote in her book that I just found irresistible. She talks about how a lot of these businesses, they think, I've got a great product. Why am I not minting money? And the book explains a lot of that in a way that, again, it's not judgmental. She's trying to teach these folks sort of what they have to understand. And the other thing that was so interesting in the book was that she'll talk to a lot of companies. And I hear a lot of them say this too. They'll say, we haven't done any marketing. And they don't understand what marketing is. Of course, if you think about it, one of those models like the 4 Ps, which came out in 1960, still works. I think it's better than nothing. But it's marketing is your product. It's the pricing. How do you charge, and how does the customer buy? It's the place, meaning how do you distribute it? Are you selling through channels? Are you selling online? Do you have distributors? All this sort of thing. And then the 4th P, and it's in this order for a reason, is promotion. Mm-hmm. You don't really want to promote your product until you got those first 3 out of the way. So a lot of companies then start to understand that they've actually been making marketing decisions every single day. They just haven't been maybe paying money for promotion. So that helps them. But the quote that she had in there, I don't know where it came from, but she said, "He who has a thing to sell and goes and whispers in a well is not so apt to get the dollars as he who climbs a tree and hollers."
And that's perfect, because that kind of is her one takeaway, right? Which is, don't undervalue marketing. It can make a massive difference for your organization.
Yes, and right. She talked about that at the very beginning. She's saying she has plenty of case studies to show how it's made an enormous difference. It's turned sales growth trends into a hockey stick, but you kind of have to know what you're doing. It's like back when I was more in the advertising world. The joke was that everyone was an advertising expert because they had all seen television ads at one time.
Of course.
And so people who have been exposed to marketing thinking, "Oh, that's what marketing is. Oh, okay."
Yeah, or a magazine ad.
Yeah, I wish it were that easy. So
no doubt. Well, so her one thing you could do was just stop and articulate who your customer is, and then just ask yourself if you're doing everything that customer needs. Yeah. So Very simple. One thing you can do, again, for me, that's the biggest takeaway of the book overall. There's a ton. It's everything from soup to nuts here, honestly, in the book, and in a very tight way. I think it would be very good for an entrepreneur who maybe has an invention or a product or something like that, and then is now in the business world of trying to get this out to the market and to the world, understanding what that it does and what that process looks like on a very short basis.
Yeah, and I think a lot of venture capitalists should probably read the book.
Yes.
And
just based on my experience.
Yeah, well, because they're hemorrhaging money. Like, it's really so funny that they're financial whizzes or supposed to be, and yet they waste a lot of money on the wrong kind of sales and marketing approaches. So, the dirty little secret of the book, though, and I can't remember if I mentioned this during the interview, is that this book applies to bigger companies too.
Oh yeah. Sheesh. It's the same thing about the products. You could go in there and say, well, what does your ideal customer look like? Ideal customer? This is astonishing. So
there's only so many companies we can help at one time, James.
Yeah. Well, there's the thing you can do. Just focus on your customer. That would be a great first step. As you mentioned in your keynote last time we did this, I'm all about maximizing my reading time, and I think that Beyond Product has probably got to be one of the highest payoff books because it's just so concise.
Yep.
And the insights are all very salient. So great payoff in your investment of time in this particular one. So I could tell that you enjoyed the book too. Any particular point in there you plan to leverage the most?
Probably the way that she explains things. In other words, I've been working on some other presentations, and I'm borrowing from her book, and I show a picture of the book and I show a picture of her, but even just the title is helpful because so many companies, and certainly with manufacturers we work with, they think it's all about the product, and there's a reason why. I mean, there's a reason why they're very focused on the product, but it's they've got to go beyond that. And I think more and more of them are understanding that. They realize they can't interrupt people and they can't pay for attention like they used to. So they're having to earn their attention, and they can't do that if they're not focused on their customers and their customers' problems before they start warbling on about their product.
Yep. Amen. All right. Well, last up, we've got the 10 stories that great leaders tell by Paul Smith. And I'm a huge Paul Smith fan. One of his other titles, Sell with a Story, has been on my desk here actually ever since I read it. It's all marked up and highlighted. So I was really excited to see maybe some of those principles applied to leadership in this book. So tell us a little bit about Paul Smith's The 10 Stories That Great Leaders Tell.
This book only takes an hour to read, and as I told him in the interview, it took me an hour and 16 minutes because I kept stopping to write down ideas. But it's a beautiful book. It's a great book to give to your CEO or any kind of leadership in your company.
And it'll get read too because it's so tight.
Yeah. It's. I mean, you really have to know what storytelling is, and he has spent years working on that and can really explain it. And this was, if you are hearing the term storytelling, you're not quite sure what it is, read this book. As I told him, I didn't really understand this whole storytelling thing until a few years ago when I read his book, Sell with a Story, which is just one of the greatest sales books. And he explains that storytelling is very misunderstood by businesses. It's not about making things up, first off. It's about presenting information in the way that the human brain wants to receive it and to remember it. So you put something in a story form. And he works with a lot of companies and gives keynotes all over the world. So for those people that understand that they need a story, the number one question he's always getting is, okay, I get it. Which story should I work on first? So in other words, in his book, Sell with a Story, he showed the 25 different types of stories every salesperson and company should have. Now, they're not the same story. In other words, the story of your founding, the story of a happy customer, all these different types of things. This one was some of those. And one of the things that we talked about was how this is not a book just for CEOs. You could have a department of one, but if you're having to lead change in your organization, you're a leader. And the way you do that is by telling stories. So these were sort of the greatest hits, and he gives an example of them. And they are, like, for instance, I mentioned the founding story. That's like where we came from. And he explains the elements of that story. You don't want, a Moby Dick there's a few things you need to explain about where you came from and how to explain them. And there's another one that so many of these are relevant to sales and marketing, but the next one was called Why We Can't Stay Here, which is a case for change.
Mm-hmm.
Now, CEOs need to be always trying to manage change, but every single person who has the job title of sales, they're in the change business. They're selling change. And that's super relevant. But he's got others about your vision and corporate values. I'm just looking through the table of contents.
Yes, there's strategy. There's the customer story. Probably the best for our audience is sales story and marketing story.
Yeah.
And you spent some time on that because that's
right. Well, and it's like the sales story. It's not what you sell. The title of chapter 7 is What We Do for Our Customers, and you put that in this story format. And then like what he calls the marketing story, chapter 8, it's how we're different from our competitors. But you put it in a story format and people get it.
And his illustrations there are excellent, by the way. So the story he's using to illustrate the concept is a perfect, and it's for a fairly basic business. So I really thought that was great.
And there's hundreds of kinds of stories that he's documented. But these were the 10 that he said, the ones that come up most often. And so I think, if somebody only read one book about storytelling, they should read this one. And I think that salespeople would really benefit from this.
Me too. And it's an easy place to start also if you're just getting into this storytelling. And then and there's a nice template in the back of the book kind of explain how to do it.
Well, and he says, look, don't try and do all 10 of these. Here's a little grid in the back. I think he's also got a workbook that goes with this book, but he's got a grid in the back saying, figure out which one of these is the most important right now. Okay. Then number them 1 through 10 and just start on the first one and determine who's going to help you put that story together. And you can do it rather quickly. And this is a great example of the secret of getting ahead is getting started because it doesn't have to be perfect. But if you start on it, within telling it 2 or 3 times, you can start revising it and realizing, okay, I can rough out some of those edges, and people are going to appreciate and understand what I'm trying to explain to them even better.
Yeah, if you did one a month, you could have them all done before the end of the year. So, now, in fact, what you just said, it was his takeaway, right? Is to say, just take whatever one you think is the most important story for you and implement that now.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, today I hear from listeners every day, and they're always asking, as I invite them to ask, what's a good book or recommendation or whatever. And I heard from this one consultant in Canada, and she said, got about 18 clients. It's a service-based business, and what are some books? And she picked out one that was on the show earlier this year, Small Business Guide to Marketing by Rohit Bhargava, which was equally brilliant. And I had recommended that they also give those clients The New Rules of Marketing and PR by David Merriman Scott, which is in its 6th edition, and I recommended this book too. I think it's a wonderful gift.
Nice trifecta, actually. Well, I would say that the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell provides a great step-by-step guidance on how to identify the stories that are key for your business, how to construct those stories for massive impact. So honestly, I can't think of a leader in any organization that wouldn't benefit from this. And like you said, I think even sales and marketing individuals could benefit from this.
Yeah. And it's sort of like the Beyond Product where I read it and I just marveled at how did you figure out what not to put in here?
It's only because he's done it so long.
I know.
Yes, so that's why it's getting good at it.
It's like great sculpture, it's about removing all the parts that don't need to be there. So,
yeah, excellent. Well, this month's books are another stellar collection of big name authors and insightful books. So tell us what new books you have coming up on the Marketing Book Podcast.
We have The 3-Minute Rule, Say Less to Get More from Any Pitch or Presentation by Brad Pinvidic. And the next book is They Ask You Answer, A Revolutionary Approach to Inbound Sales, Content Marketing in Today's Digital Consumer, revised and updated 2nd edition by Marcus Sheridan. Social Media Success for Every Brand, The 5 Story Brand Pillars That Turn Posts into Profits by Claire Diaz-Ortiz. And Lessons, Essays to Help You Embrace the Chaos by Mark Schaefer, who, when he's on the show, he will be the one and only member of the Marketing Book Podcast 6 Timers Club.
the king.
That's right. He's the king of the Marketing Book Podcast now, much like Elvis was the king of rock and roll, or is, I should say. And that's it for this month's B2B Growth Show Book Talk. To learn more about the Marketing Book Podcast, visit marketingbookpodcast.com. See what I did there? And to learn more about James and his excellent book, one of my favorites, The Perfect Close, visit puremuir.com. That's spelled PUREMUIR.com. And if either of us can recommend a specific sales or marketing book or other resource for whatever situation you find yourself in, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn where we can chat, and we'll do our best to get you pointed in the right direction. And remember, keep learning, because these days the big learners are big earners.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.